you can join us in the future. If you are not already on Global Exchange's alert list, please click in the comments bar on the place where you're watching this, either in Zoom, Facebook, or YouTube. We'll sign you up for future webcasts and send you a link to a recording of tonight's broadcast. Please also use that comment bar to send us any questions and comments you have during the webinar. We really want to hear from you, and we'll try to get to as many of your questions as possible. We've got a lot of talent on board tonight, so let's get right to it. David Huey represents the Kroc Institute in Colombia, and he is the coordinator of the Barometer Initiative, which monitors the implementation of the peace agreement in Colombia as part of the international verification component. Jimena Sanchez Garzoli directs the Andes program for the Washington Office on Latin America, usually known as WOLA, and is their leading Colombia human rights advocate. Our third guest, Alejandro Castillejo Cuellar, is an associate professor of anthropology at the University of the Andes, and we are still waiting for him to show up. He is in the field tonight. We hope he's going to be able to come in to give us some very live coverage of what's going on in Colombia. But David, let's start with you. You've led teams of professionals working on sustainable development, human rights, protection, and peace for the last 20 years. Please tell us a little bit more about who you are and the work you do to support peace and reconciliation in Colombia.
Thanks, Ted. First of all, I'd like to thank you for organizing this webinar on such an important topic and such an important time. Thanks to all your viewers for tuning in as well. Well, my name is David Huey. I'm a political economist. As you said, I've been working for over 20 years on development, human rights, and peace-building issues, mostly in Latin America, but also a time in the Middle East and former Soviet Union sphere. I moved to Colombia in 2005. I was director of Oxfam International here for many years, then a consultant working on peace building, planning for post-conflict once the peace agreement was signed between the FARC and the government. And finally, last year I joined Kroc Institute as their representative and the coordinator of the Barometer Initiative. The Barometer is a project that started at the end of 2016, when the agreement was signed. The government and the FARC invited the University of Notre Dame to participate as the official verifiers of the state of implementation of the agreement. It's a completely innovative mechanism in a comprehensive peace agreement like Colombia. There's never been an academic partner for the parties before. And the Barometer is the result of a wider project called the Peace Accords Matrix, which looks at the implementation of 34 peace agreements signed since the end of the Cold War across the globe. The difference is that in Colombia, this is the only experience where there's an actual verification and follow-up on the implementation of the agreement in real time, so that we can inform decision makers about what's working and what the potential bottlenecks are and how implementation could be made more effective, so that they can alter their decisions and hopefully speed things up, but also make the implementation more sustainable.
That's fantastic, David. We look forward to hearing a lot more about that as we go on with tonight's webcast. Jimena, your work is very well known and has helped shed light on the situation of Colombia's more than 7 million internally displaced persons, as well as help expose the links between Colombia's government and drug-funded paramilitaries. And there's so much more. Can you please tell us who you are and about the work you do to support peace and reconciliation in Colombia?
Thank you, Ted, and hello to all of the viewers. Thank you for taking the time to learn more about Colombia. I'm Jimena Sanchez, the Director for the Andes at the Washington Office on Latin America. I've been at the Washington Office for Latin America 15 years. Basically, we are a non-governmental organization that does not receive any funding from the US government. And what we do is monitor US assistance and policies towards the region. I run the Colombia program, which is focused on looking at implementation of human rights conditions tied to US military assistance, as well as the economic aid package. And also, we have agreements with ethnic authorities in Colombia and civil society organizations to help bring their voices to US policymakers and take US policymakers to Colombia.
That's fantastic. And again, we look forward to hearing a lot more about that. Alejandro from the University of the Andes has still not shown up, so I will hold on the introduction of him. We'll move straight to the first question to you, David. And this is a big question. And I simply, what was behind the 50 years of civil war in Colombia? What brought about the success of efforts to resolve the conflict, and have those issues that led to war for all those years been resolved? That's a lot, but help us out with that question.
Yeah, it's a huge question, Ted. Well, I think we could sum up the cause of, well, I would dispute if it's a civil war. I would say it was a multi-dimensional internal armed conflict. It may have begun as a civil war, but it transformed over time with the evolution of the armed actors themselves, the context in which the armed conflict took place. But I would sum it up as exclusion. Vast parts of Colombia had no development whatsoever, in fact continue to have little or no development. People were excluded from the political process. For decades, the liberals and conservatives, the only two political parties, took turns to take power and govern the country. But the real problems were in the countryside, where particularly land distribution was extremely unfair, continues to be so. And then there was the period of violence after the liberal leader Gaitan was assassinated. That led to what they call the Bogotazo, which was a huge uprising of the liberals following his death, because everyone expected him to become president. And they destroyed large parts of the center of the city.
What was that, David?
The Bogotazo.
Yes.
And then that led to a period of violence, extreme violence, which was similar to the most recent 50-year conflict, which was resolved essentially by a national pact between the liberals and conservatives to share power. But that didn't do anything to redistribute either economic or political power with the rest of the country. So in the early 60s, the FARC were formed. It was basically a peasant movement, which decided that given the high levels of political and economic exclusion, their only option was to try to take power and take control of the state by armed struggle. However, they were unsuccessful, clearly. The armed conflict went on for 50 years. It transformed over time. For pragmatic reasons, they got involved in the drug trafficking and taxing the production of coca, which in many parts of the country is the only way for poor farmers to survive, given that the economic model in rural areas isn't really sustainable for small farmers. So what led the parties to sit down and talk? I think there are many complex reasons. I think one of the main reasons was the election of President Uribe in 2002, with strong support from the United States in its anti-narcotic policy, billions of dollars of assistance, military assistance to the Colombian government, and a very successful military strategy of targeting the FARC leaders. Many were killed, including their at one stage their maximum leader. And I think the FARC commanders realized that one, they weren't going to be able to take over the state as they originally planned. Two, their leaders were being systematically targeted with high technology and completely adapted anti-guerrilla elite commando form of counterinsurgency, plus loss of support from the international community, including Fidel Castro, who said at one stage that, you know, that the era of revolutionary armed struggle was basically over. So I think there are many reasons, and I'm sure there are many more. Jimena will give more examples, but I think essentially the FARC felt squeezed, plus the international community came together and offered their support, including the Cubans and the Norwegians as guarantors for the process. And I think general clamor in society for a peaceful solution. People were tired of endless conflict. Another turning point, I think, was when President Santos took over after 8 years of President Uribe. And having been the Minister of Defense and quite hawkish, he actually changed strategy and set out a stall for peace, initiating initially back channels facilitated by Cuba, Norway, and others to reach out to the FARC. The FARC, from their side, for the reasons I've just stated, were also interested in a negotiated solution, and the talks were born. So, as I say, the rest is history. But it did take, it wasn't an easy process. It took 4 years, including the involvement of lots of advisors on either side, involvement of civil society, women's group, ethnic leaders. Unfortunately, wider civil society wasn't involved in the process, but certain groups did manage to have their voices heard, including the victims, by the way, in Havana. And that's what led to the most comprehensive peace agreement signed so far.
Yes, and thank you, David. That's one of the reasons we wanted to hear from Alejandro, because he helped to represent the victims in Havana. Jimena, you've just returned from recent travels to Aruca, to Catatumbo, Chocó, Nariño, places where the peace process is playing out in sometimes messy detail on the ground. Can you give us a sense of what's going on now and help us understand why thousands of Colombians have also taken to the streets of major cities and elsewhere in recent months? Is there a connection between what is and is not happening with the peace process and recent dissent?
Yes. There was much hope when the peace process was going on, and then when it was eventually signed. Also, during that time, the second guerrilla group, the ELN, had a brief bilateral ceasefire that also gave people hope that beyond the agreement with the FARC, there might be actual changes with the other actors as well, not just the leftist actors, but others. Unfortunately, since President Duque has been in government, basically, we've seen major rollback in many ways. Part of it has been because the Colombian government basically has slowed or tried all it can to raise obstacles to different parts of the agreement, from not funding important parts of it to trying to change the transitional justice system, to also changing its focus and picking and choosing what should be implemented. So in places like Catatumbo that I was just in 2 weeks ago, we see a situation where rural farmers basically came together with municipalities, with the governors, with everyone to come up with an alternative development plan, and agreed with the government on different steps that they were going to take. And the government hasn't delivered. It's delivered some primary humanitarian assistance, but it hasn't delivered on the implementation of Chapter 1 of the Peace Agreement, which is rural land reform, which is basically everything you need to get started with changing some of the structural causes of inequality and violence in the country, which are basic infrastructure, basic services for rural farmers, so that they don't involve themselves in the illicit economies or are recruited into the illegal armed groups. And so there's a major frustration coming about in those areas. At the same time, the FARC demobilized in the entire country, which has been an amazing feat. And we see that about 200 of the demobilized have been killed since then. We also see that while there's been some initial assistance in a lot of the sites that they're in, the post assistance has been very minimal. I visited one area in Arauca 4 months ago where the leaders of the FARC there were very happy to have a whole host of different alternative projects, Sancha Inchi, and all sorts of other things that they had developed through cooperatives. But to get to where they were took about 2.5 hours through a road that you wouldn't be able to easily transport anything in and out or take anything to market. And that area was basically an area where you had other illegal armed groups, mostly the regrouped paramilitaries or criminal bands that were all a threat to all of their lives. And so what we've seen is that the Duque government, which basically campaigned on the fact that they were going to rip up the accord, has not been able to completely do that because the international community has heavily pushed back on that. But it is definitely trying very hard to either change the terms of the peace or to implement its own agenda, and through that other agenda, call it peace when it's not really what was signed in the accord. What happened at the end of last year was basically that a combination of things brought many different Colombians from different walks of life, and for the first time really middle class and also urban Colombians to the streets. It was several different labor reform and tax packages that the Center Democratic Party wanted to push through, combined with the tremendous frustration of the lack of implementation of the accords, a general sense by many Colombians that they weren't quite sure how their government was really governing. Duque, it came out today, has a very high disapproval rating, for example, partly because of some of the fights that he's had internally with his party and so forth. And at the same time, you had that whole accumulation of expectation that had come from the accords basically pouring itself out in the streets. So what what was initially a very peaceful march ended up becoming a march that was treated as if most people who were marching were criminals. We saw excessive use of force by the anti-riot police, leading to the death of a youngster named Dylan Cruz. And that just ignited everybody after he was killed. And so that was partly why we had these protests for a long time. Now, there was a committee that was put together, led by mostly the labor unions, that has tried to negotiate with the government to come up with some kind of solutions. And what we've seen is that the government has basically ignored them. It said, yes, we'll do something, but we're just going to do our general dialogue. So last week, they had a general dialogue where they basically invited all of the people who didn't march, which were the private sector and other interests, to negotiate with them, rather than the people that they should be talking to, which were the ones who were the people out in the streets during that entire time.
Great. Thanks for that. And we can have a couple of comments and questions that have come in over the web, and I'm just going to give those to you now. The first one, can you hear me okay? The first one is just saludos cordiales desde Mexico. So we have warm greetings from Mexico. We're watching. Another question is, says Colombia is with the United States collaborating with the golpistas in Bolivia. What do you make of that? And we have another comment here that and maybe David, you could respond to this because I think it goes to your commentary. The aid that was coming from the United States isn't aid; it's sometimiento. It's putting Colombia under the thumb of the United States. I'm translating that. We're getting our questions in Spanish. It's very interesting. So could the two of you speak to those questions?
I'm not going to speak to the first one, Ted, because I really don't have an answer.
Yeah.
And it's out of my mandate. So, but the second question, well, my experience of USAID funding it's not sometimiento. On the contrary, USAID is in some of the most remote parts of Colombia trying to do alternative development and promote greater participation of society generally. My experience of USAID programs is fairly positive. I understand why people would be suspicious given the history of involvement of the United States in internal political affairs throughout Latin America. But my experience of USAID funding in Colombia anyway, these days, is fairly positive. They're right behind the implementation of the peace agreement. Many of their programs are trying to fill in for where funding from the Colombian government isn't available for the reasons, whatever reason that may be. But, I would just like to make a general comment about the state of the implementation. I think one of the biggest dangers to the Colombian peace process is an excessive pessimism about the possibilities of success, including, I would say, mostly from the left and from progressive sectors who are disappointed and perhaps have unrealistic expectations of what's possible in a very short time frame. And in order to give some perspective, according to our data in the Peace Accord Matrix, which, as I said in my introduction, covers 34 countries across the globe, the rate of implementation of the Colombian peace agreement is roughly average. Now, that's not to say that it couldn't be better and we wouldn't like it to be better, but in terms of the Colombian state and other actors fulfilling their commitments, we can say that the Colombian peace agreement is neither worse nor better than other peace agreements across the world. The other thing I'd like to share is that according to our coding system, and I should explain that the Kroc Institute, the Barometer's methodology, took the text of the Havana Agreement and identified 578 measurable commitments by the actors. And we divided them into sub-themes and we put them into our matrix, which so that we could codify between 0 and 3 their level of implementation over time. And what we've been able to verify and what the data shows is that so far, after only 3 years, 40% of the agreement is either fully complete or in an intermediary level of completion, which means that if the rhythm of implementation continues as it currently is, there's a very good chance that those stipulations or commitments will be fulfilled within the 15-year time frame determined in Havana. So as far as we're concerned, the peace process has its difficulties, it has challenges. It's definitely slowed up in the last year or so, but that's not necessarily due to a lack of political will. The political will issue is extremely difficult to prove. And what we prefer not to apportion blame, but rather to look at how the stipulations, their commitments by the actors are being implemented or not. And therefore, the methodology of having a matrix and being able to codify almost scientifically the level of implementation.
Okay, thank you very much for that, David. That helps a lot. I think that the questioner, when they were talking about U.S. aid, simply talking about the AID program, but also military aid and the whole package. What have you seen in terms of trends around that, and the I know at times there's been a very what looked to me like a pernicious effect from U.S. military aid in the country. What are you seeing now, and how do you view that?
Well, I think there's been a tremendous evolution in the USAID program in Colombia, and that really had to do with the fact that 12 years ago, since the program was so ineffective and was also funding things that they shouldn't, like money laundering mechanisms of paramilitary groups, which they weren't even funding them because they wanted to, but because they were so clueless about what they were doing. Um, there was great pressure to develop something called a basically consultation strategy with independent civil society. So for the military aid, the State Department has to certify that certain human rights conditions in US legislation are being met, mainly that the armed forces aren't committing extrajudicial killings, they're not colluding and working with successor paramilitary groups, that they're actually protecting social leaders, that kind of thing. And that process really was what brought about some major changes in the conduct of the Colombian armed forces. So there was a time during the President Uribe's period where the Colombian military basically committed a huge number of extrajudicial killings, which basically followed taking people, torturing them, usually undesirables or poor farmers, and then showing them as guerrillas killed in combat because they wanted to up body counts to show that they were having success in their military actions. So because the intervention and the dialogue that occurred in these mechanisms helped to push for that to stop, there was a lot of interest in US policymakers to do something similar on USAID. And so there's been literally 12 of these consultations and ongoing engagement, and there's been a gradual change in the type of assistance. So one way that has changed is that, first of all, a lot of the most pernicious or things are no longer being funded. There's strict criteria to guarantee that funding is actually useful and going where it's supposed to be. A second part is that the implementers are no longer just the contractors, but you actually have direct implementing partners that are well-known and credible Colombian non-governmental organizations like the Pastoral Social and like CODES. You also have now, for the first time ever, an Afro-Colombian and Indigenous program that directly funds Afro-Colombian and Indigenous authorities. And that came about really because of all of this engagement over time. I would say, having been part of these 12 consultations, that I've seen a tremendous evolution. I've also seen that there's an effort to often try to be very effective with the aid, unlike before. Less of a tendency to support anything that would be more public relations for the Colombian government, more support for the independent agencies, the justice system, and now USAID is the leading funder for land titling in Colombia, understanding that that's key to turning things around and implementing the accord. On the other subject that was mentioned, though, I would like to say, in Washington, we tend to see the true side of the Colombian government because they come and lobby all the time to our Congress. And their message is very clear. Their message is that initially they didn't want this peace accord, that it was in the peace accord that was signed by the Santos government, and it was basically going to lead to complete impunity. That's what they lobbied for. Then they got a lot of pushback for that. So now they're like, oh, no, we're following the peace. Why are you, attacking us? However, the biggest problem isn't Colombia, it's Venezuela. And we're your biggest allies on Venezuela. So we need a lot of money and we need a lot of your support. Secondly, we still have this huge drug problem, which was of course caused by the peace accord, according to them. And we have to start aerial fumigation again, because that's the only way that we're going to be able to undo that. At the same time, they're pushing a lot this Zona Futuros, which is a militarized approach, which is basically a regurgitation of what has been the consolidation zones in the past during the prime time of Plan Colombia, which is basically militarize first and then bring in all of the other basic services in these areas, which hasn't worked in the past. And so I think Colombia is very good at giving on a lot of formalities. It will make new programs, it will make promises and what have you. But where you see what they're really behind is where they put their money, and also where you're seeing results. And you're not seeing the results that you're supposed to be seeing at this time.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jimena. And one of my questions for Alejandro, who I don't think is going to join us tonight, was exactly that about Venezuela, because he's on the border there tonight, and this is why I think he's having trouble getting through. It's a kind of remote area, but Venezuela is embroiled in internal and international tensions. What is it, Jimena, that's going on there, and how is that playing out in Colombia? What kind of threat or not do you think that represents the Colombia's peacemaking? You talked about how the government is using it as something of a smokescreen or a distraction, but can you just talk a little bit more about that dynamic between the two countries?
Sure. Well, Venezuela was one of the countries that supported the peace process and did play a role, although I would say that Cuba and Norway really led things in that process. And so, it played a role. Venezuela and Colombia have always had a complicated relationship of, being brothers and sisters, but then at the same time getting at each other's throats. Every once in a while, it happened under the Uribe administration, blame here, blame there. The truth is that more than 3 million Colombians fled to Venezuela during the conflict, and Venezuela basically integrated them. Now you have a situation where on the Venezuelan side, due to the internal politics there and the state being unable to meet the demands of its people and all of the problems that you're seeing there and the collapse of the economy and what have you, that thousands of Venezuelans are fleeing. Colombia has been the country that has gotten the most of them. So there are about 1.6 million plus Venezuelans in Colombia. Most of them cross through the very porous border, which is very easy to cross. And at first, many of them were transitioning through Colombia and going to Peru, Ecuador, and Brazil, but then other countries started closing their doors. And so most of them are remaining in Colombia. I visited the Venezuelans along the Nariño-Ecuador border and the border all along Venezuela in 3 different points in the past couple months. And what I can say is that given the huge number of Venezuelans, Colombia is, in many senses, trying to help them as much as they can. Now, the government claims that, they should be given more money to do more. We're very skeptical because their response to displaced people in their own country has been so poor due to capacity issues, due to corruption, due to many other issues. What is happening, which we find problematic, is that the Colombian government has been basically saying things that are an exaggeration. For example, one, that the major narco trafficking is happening through Venezuela. Venezuela has had narco trafficking happening to it for a very long time now, but it's not the only way that the drugs get out of the country. A lot of the drugs also get out through the Pacific and through Ecuador. The other thing that they've been saying is that the ELN, the second guerrilla group, is now an international threat. Now, the ELN has grown in terms of numbers and recruitment, especially since they saw things, the promises not being made in terms of the peace agreement, and the Duque government taking a very hardline approach towards them to continue negotiations. And, they've committed mass atrocities. I mean, while I was in Arauca and Saravena, in 1 week's time, there were 5 bombings by them, which I saw with my own eyes. So, they're a completely irreproachable group in their commitments and what they're doing. However, exaggerating the situation in order to get an intervention, especially a military one, by the United States or something else is not going to help matters. You need to have consolidated peace in Colombia to be able to integrate these Venezuelans in an effective manner. And you also need to find dialogue and a solution in Venezuela to better that situation so that the spillover doesn't completely destabilize a lot of these post-conflict areas of Colombia that already had the situation where many of the local population was unable to meet their basic needs or the level of employment that they needed.
Thanks, Jimena. And I just want to remind people who are listening that we are talking about Colombia and the peace process. We are with Jimena Sanchez of the Washington Institute on Latin America and David Huey of the Kroc Institute located in Bogota. He is the representative in Colombia for the Kroc Institute, and we're talking about the various aspects of Colombia's peace process. We've got some new questions coming in, and let me take this one, David. The question, and maybe you can give a quick response to this, was who sets the priorities for the implementation of the 500 plus parts of the peace agreement? Is it the government or agents of the poor? Who sets the priorities?
That's an extremely good question, I must say, and very topical. Well, point 6 of the agreement is all about verification. One of the entities created in point 6 is a commission made up of 3 members of the government, 3 members of the FARC, and their job basically is to meet, according to the agreement, every 15 days to talk about implementation and to reach agreements. Because obviously one thing is to design and negotiate and sign a peace agreement in Havana in 2016, quite another to actually implement it with all the complexity and changing context in 2020. So the idea, I think, behind the design of this commission was for the parties, the signing parties to the agreement, to have a vehicle for, first of all, prioritizing implementation. And there's a tool used by the government called in Spanish, Plan Marco de Implementación, or implementation framework plan. And that is basically the government's planning of how do you translate the Colombian agreement into public policy and actionable activities by the state, investment in the 5 points. The problem is the commission has been meeting regularly, but not as regularly as it should have. It's only been meeting once a month instead of twice a month. And when they meet, they agree to disagree, basically. It's more declarations on one side and the other about their inconformities, about what the other is doing. So what we're seeing is a kind of hiatus in the commission. Plus, there's in the international verification component where we participate, there was a figure created in the Havana Agreement called the International Notables, with the former presidents of Uruguay and Spain. And they haven't been very notable. There's a joke in Colombia that they're notable for their absence rather than for what they actually do. And their mandate is actually expired, and no one is talking about the need to reinvigorate what we consider an extremely important accompaniment of the process. Because if a commission that was established where the 2 parties could get together and agree on prioritization and resolve disputes or disagreements about aspects of implementation, if there's no international accompaniment, or the international accompaniment was originally designed has expired, then who do they appeal to? Mm-hmm. So one of our recommendations would be, let's have a look at that international accompaniment, and if the 2 presidents that were originally nominated are no longer interested or fit for purpose or appropriate or whatever, let's look at who could replace those quote unquote notables. So to answer the question, the implementation should be consensually agreed between the parties according to the spirit of the agreement. But at the moment, there's a big debate between the government and the FARC about just exactly what the scope or flexibility of the Colombian government is. And the Colombian government has been saying recently that the Constitutional Court has ruled that each government in turn can decide what it wants to implement in the agreement. So what the Constitutional Court has actually said is every government has to govern and has to do its prioritization. However, that cannot contradict the spirit of the agreement, and the spirit of the agreement is integral. So although they will prioritize, and of course, funding issues and availability of resources and the fiscal stability of the country are all very important. Yeah. However, I think the key issue here is, are the two parties agreeing on that prioritization? And is the prioritization of the government through their public policy creation aligned with the integral spirit of the original agreement as signed in Colombia in 2016?
Okay, thank you for that answer, David. That question was...
And it's a kind of a complicated answer, but essentially the two parties really should prioritize implementation, but the government or the state is obviously responsible for the vast majority of the commitments in the agreement because it's the only actor with the capacity and resource to do so.
I think Mr. Goldhammer is going to be very happy with your answer. That was, you engage it very well. We've got a bunch of questions coming in, so let me roll through with a few of these. We have one that from Dunache Takaida in I'm not sure from where, asking that what are the reasons for the U.S. sanctioning Venezuela? I'm not sure if we can get into that in this. Mariana Sainz asks why do Mexico and Colombia not work together to stop the passage of drugs? That they make the drugs, we distribute them. This question is coming from Mexico. Isn't there some way they could work together to
flaws? A new approach, which was to try and give other things a chance, like this alternative development plan, combined with rural land reform, redistribution of land, combined with better political participation and strengthening of the collective land rights of Afro-Colombian and indigenous people. So there was great hope that this was going to go somewhere, and you had thousands of farmers basically sign on the dotted line that they would eradicate manually the coca if the government followed through on all this. And what we've seen, which is what I was mentioning a bit in the beginning, is that the Colombian government under Duque has said that was a crazy idea. Hopes were generated way too broadly. We don't have the money. And they've started just giving some subsidies in terms of humanitarian aid, but not initiating the long-term changes that are needed. And we haven't seen advancement in the rural land reform. And now they're saying, well, we need to start fumigation again. So we think that would be going back to a policy that didn't work for many years, that was highly destructive. The problem they have is that Colombia's own courts have stated that the aerial herbicide is a problem. And so they need to figure out a different way to do it. So they're trying to do that. So going back to that kind of policy, which is attacking the drugs in a military fashion, not just through the herbal herbicide, but also through militarizing areas and what have you, is not going to solve the problem. It's just going to make a situation we have increased human rights violations and more people in a situation of desperation.
So the person who asked that question wrote back and they say, what we really want to hear about is what would drug policy reform in the United States decriminalize?
United States.
Or
I apologize. Okay.
could that still affect Colombia? Would that be something that, people could do? There are other questions. What can people here in the United States do to make this situation better? It seems very remote. Is there something that we can do? Would drug policy reform in the United States have a positive impact in Colombia? Would it reverse any of those nasty trends that you're describing?
Well, I think that you need to have a completely integral approach to drug policy that includes both changes at the country level and then changes in the United States. I don't really see that happening now under the Trump administration. I mean, states have a lot of rights, and we see major changes in terms of cannabis, but I don't see major changes in terms of cocaine. And the reality is that that's what's driving the drugs is the market here in the U.S. And so, yes, it would have an impact. The question is, how do you really do that? And can you really get under the government that we have now the types of things you would need, like looking at drug issue as a public health problem, less criminalization of people involved in the drug trade, and more of an effort on real interdiction and looking at how you address really money laundering, because that's how you really get the money in a serious manner in banks all over the world, and especially those in the United States. I'm not sure you're going to get that under this government. But I do think that, yeah, that's the way to go, and that should be what should be done. I mean, the chapter 4 of the agreement said that it should start dialogues with the international actors, really United States and Europe, about those sorts of things, but we haven't seen that move forward. We've seen a new government come in saying we want to go back to the old policies.
Okay, thank you for that, Jimena. I'm getting word in that we're having some trouble with the live streaming of the video. So we're still here going just fine on Zoom. We'll keep this going because everyone will be able to hear the recording later. We've got another question in, and I'll leave the David. I'd like you to take the one about the Truth Commission if you can, but I'll just read this other question that came in from Kathleen Nolan. She asks, what is the role of the faith community, the Catholic Church and others in the implementation of the peace agreement? They were not involved in the negotiations, or were they, is her question. So David, can you talk about the role of the Peace Commission and what the prospects for that are? And then Jimena, could you talk about the role of the church after that in the peace process? We've got about 6 minutes left in our broadcast. We want to thank everybody for being with us for this closer look at Colombia with David Huey of the Kroc Institute and Jimena Sanchez from the Washington Office on Latin America. David, please go ahead.
Can you just remind me what the exact question was?
The question was, what do you think are the prospects for the Truth Commission in Colombia to address the United States' role in the war in Colombia? How do you see the prospects for the Truth Commission generally? But maybe focus on that first part, the prospects for the Truth Commission to address the United States' role in the war in Colombia. Is that going to happen? Is it important?
I really don't know is the honest answer.
Okay.
But I can say that the Truth Commission, I think, is one of the more, on point 5 generally, is one of the more successful points of implementation of the agreement. The Truth Commission is up and running. It's now reaching the territories. Lots of groups are coming forward, including women and ethnic communities who have been most impacted by the armed conflict, to tell their stories. I think that there's, it will produce a report in the near future. So I think that telling the truth is one of the low-hanging fruits, if you like, in that it doesn't require a huge amount of resources. Like point 1, it doesn't require 15 years to be implemented. It could be implemented relatively quickly. And it can give Colombian people and the victims in particular what is desperately needed, which is what actually happened and why. So I think that the Truth Commission for me is one of the highlights of the agreement, and I think it's an area where the agreement can move forward relatively quickly and have a significant impact in terms of turning the corner, turning the page of Colombian history, and putting a lot of dynamics behind, because once the truth is out and it's clear who was responsible and why, it's much, much more difficult for those dynamics to be repeated. So to answer the question, I don't know if that will throw up connections with the role of the United States, but I do know that once the Commission's report is published, I'm sure it will have a profound effect on Colombian society and for the good.
Well, thank you. And Jimena, do you want to close with that question on what the role of faith community has been in the peace process? I know internationally the faith community has been a backbone of peace and justice efforts. We would love to hear your thoughts on that. And if you do have any thoughts about the Truth Commission, please feel free to comment on that as well.
Well, on the Catholic Church, I think it depends what part of the Catholic Church you're talking about. I mean, the Pope has tried to push for peace. The Vatican has been very supportive of peace. And then you see throughout the entire Pacific region, bishops on down completely being the biggest advocates for peace. However, you saw the hierarchy of the Catholic Church deciding not to take a position on the plebiscite, and in some cases actually being opposed to peace. And so I think it really, you know, the Catholic Church, like in Latin America, reflects all the different sides of the society. And so you see that reflected there, you know, from the people who will stand, you know, with the poor and live with the poor, to the people who are becoming rich off of the conflict themselves. On the Truth Commission, I think it's a very diverse commission. It has some amazing things like Afro and Indigenous people, and they did a whole consultation process with Afro and Indigenous people. I think that's completely important, but they've had to fight a lot of battles. And so while I think they should completely include the US role, I think that needs to happen with Colombians and US groups really pushing for that. And making it a priority for them that they include it. I mean, I've always said the US is the third actor in the conflict in Colombia, even though it was mostly financially and technically and what have you, but I had a major role. And I think it'd be very important for that to be revealed as part of the truth of what happened.
Well, thank you again so much. Jimena Sanchez from the Washington Office on Latin America, David Huey from the Kroc Institute. I know that you're both very busy people and there's a lot of work to do to make sure that this process continues. We thank you so much for your role in that. And for those who are listening, we really encourage you to go to the very first link in your chat bar where you have an opportunity to learn about future webinars. And if you click that link and sign up, we will also send you a recording of this webinar. We know some people missed a few minutes of it. We will share this webinar again on social media. Thank you to everyone who asked questions on the YouTube platform, on the Facebook platforms, and on Zoom. We very much appreciate your thinking about these issues with us, and we look forward to continuing the dialogue. And so again, Jimena and David, thank you so much. It's been a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ted, for organizing.
Good night.
Good night.